The day I served the HOA president with a trespassing notice for her own lake parade on my property was the first time I ever saw Brenda McMillan speechless. She tried to fine me $5,000 for using the lake. So I bought the lake. And now she owes me $1.8 million. Yeah, it escalated. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And buckle in, because this is how a pontoon power trip turned into the biggest backfire of her life. My name is Mark, and until a few years ago, I considered myself semi-retired. I'd done well in real estate development, specialized in tricky acquisitions, and revitalizing undervalued properties. Nothing grand like skyscrapers, more like breathing life back into forgotten commercial strips or overlooked land parcels. It taught me patience, the importance of meticulous research, and that 9 times out of 10, the devil or the angel is in the details of a dusty deed or an obscure zoning bylaw. We moved to the Serenity Lakes community for just that. Serenity. A beautiful, man-made lake was the centerpiece, fringed by pleasant homes. My wife Clara and I had bought a small, comfortable house with modest lake frontage, just enough for our little electric pontoon boat, the Wanderer. It wasn't flashy, more practical, perfect for quiet evenings watching the sunset or teaching our grandkids how to fish for perch. For 2 glorious years, that's exactly what we did. The HOA, presided over by a woman named Brenda McMillan, seemed benign enough, mostly concerned with lawn maintenance and acceptable shades of beige for mailboxes. Little did I know, Brenda was biding her time, cultivating her little fiefdom with the focused intensity of a queen bee protecting her hive. The incident that kicked it all off happened on a flawless Saturday in late July. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The water shimmered, and a gentle breeze kept the heat pleasant. Clara was visiting her sister, so I decided to take the Wanderer out for a solo spin, maybe drop a line, enjoy the quiet. I'd been out for maybe an hour, drifting lazily near the center of the lake, lost in thought, when another pontoon, significantly larger and gaudier than mine, all gleaming chrome and ostentatious faux leather seating, pulled alongside with an aggressive swish of its oversized motor. At the helm was Brenda McMillan herself, resplendent in a violently patterned caftan, oversized sunglasses that probably cost more than my first car, and a tight, disapproving frown that seemed to be her default expression when dealing with lesser mortals. Flanking her were 2 other women I recognized vaguely from HOA meetings, both looking like understudies in self-importance. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it?" Brenda's voice cut across the tranquil air, sharp and laced with something I couldn't quite place then, but now recognize as smug condescension. I smiled politely. "Yes, Brenda, lovely day, isn't it?" She ignored the pleasantry. "Are you aware," she began, her voice rising slightly, "that use of the lake for pontooning activities is reserved for members of the Serenity Lake Preservation Club?" I blinked. "The what now? Preservation Club? I haven't heard of it. Is it new?" I was genuinely perplexed. I paid my HOA dues, kept my property immaculate. What club was this? Brenda let out a sigh that suggested I was an impossibly dense child. "It's for dedicated residents who contribute to the lake's well-being," she said, eyeing my modest boat, as if it were actively polluting the water by its mere presence. "And membership ensures priority access for recreational use like this." Her hand waved dismissively towards my boat. "This is the first I'm hearing of any such restriction or club, Brenda," I stated calmly. "The lake has always been open to all residents, as per the community bylaws I read when we moved in." Her lips thinned. "Things change, Mr. Thompson. Updates are made. Perhaps you missed the memo." She gave a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes, then gunned her engine. "I'd suggest you return to shore. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." With that, her gleaming barge powered away, leaving a wake that rocked the Wanderer more than a little. I was more confused and irritated than worried. A new club? Restricted access? It sounded utterly preposterous. I knew our HOA covenants. There was nothing in there about a preservation club having exclusive pontoon rights. I shrugged it off as Brenda being Brenda, a bit officious, a bit full of herself. I stayed out for another half hour, enjoying the peace she'd temporarily shattered, then headed home, resolving to check the latest HOA newsletter just in case I had missed something, unlikely as it seemed. The following Tuesday, the other shoe dropped. It arrived via certified mail, an official-looking envelope from the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association, Enforcement Division, which sounded far more ominous than our sleepy little HOA office usually did. Inside, on heavy cream-colored paper embossed with the HOA logo, was a violation notice. It stated, in cold, impersonal terms, that I, Mark Thompson, had violated Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 3, of the Serenity Lake Usage Regulations by operating an unpermitted watercraft in a designated club activity zone. The fine? $5,000. Payable within 30 days. My jaw literally dropped. $5,000? For what? And what club activity zone? The entire lake? I scanned the notice again. Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 3. I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants, conditions, restrictions, the CC/Rs, the legal backbone of the community. I'd read them cover to cover before buying. There was no Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 3 concerning lake usage that resembled anything remotely like what was described. There was a general section on lake upkeep and shared amenities, but nothing about exclusive clubs or $1,000 fines for using your own damn boat. The notice mentioned an attached addendum with the full updated regulations. This addendum was a freshly printed, flimsy piece of paper, not bearing any resemblance to the official CC/R document format. It detailed these new Preservation Club rules, signed at the bottom by Brenda McMillan, president, and countersigned by Harold Jenkins, treasurer, a nervous little man known more for his prize-winning petunias than his financial acumen. There was no date of adoption, no record of a community vote, nothing that indicated this was a legitimate amendment to our governing documents. It was, quite frankly, a sham. Clara was aghast when I showed her. $5,000? For going out on our boat? Mark, this is insane. Brenda can't just invent rules and fine people. That was my sentiment exactly. My initial reaction was outrage, pure and simple. My second was a grim sort of determination. This wasn't just an absurd fine. This was an abuse of power, a blatant overreach. And if Brenda McMillan thought I was just going to roll over and write a check for her Phantom Club's coffers, she had severely, catastrophically underestimated me. That evening, I didn't just reread our CC/Rs. I practically memorized them, cross-referencing them with state laws governing HOAs. The seeds of a plan, a very audacious plan, were beginning to germinate in the fertile ground of my indignation. This wasn't going to be about just getting a fine waived. Oh no. This was going to be about principle. And if there's one thing my career taught me, it's that principles, when properly leveraged, can move mountains, or, in this case, perhaps even acquire lakes. The first step, of course, was to try the conventional route. I drafted a polite but firm letter to the HOA board, formally appealing the fine, pointing out the discrepancies with the official CC/Rs, and requesting clarification on the legitimacy and adoption process of these so-called Serenity Lake Usage Regulations and the mysterious Preservation Club. I sent it via registered mail. Return receipt requested, ensuring there was a paper trail. For 2 weeks, silence. Not a peep. I knew HOA boards could be slow, but this felt deliberate. My polite follow-up emails went unanswered. My calls to the HOA office were met with a flustered receptionist, a young woman named Tiffany, who always sounded like she was on the verge of tears and could only parrot, "Mrs. McMillan handles all lake-related inquiries, and she's in a meeting." Brenda, it seemed, was perpetually in a meeting. Finally, I cornered a board member, George Peterson, a retired accountant who lived a few streets over, while he was out walking his aging golden retriever. George was a decent enough fellow, generally conflict-averse. When I broached the subject of the fine and the Preservation Club, He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Mark," he began, avoiding eye contact. "Brenda, she's very passionate about the lake. Says it needs protecting. This club, it's her initiative. Raises funds for, beautification." I pressed him. "But George, are these rules legitimate? Were they voted on? Are they part of our official CC rupees?" "Because a $5,000 fine feels less like beautification and more like extortion." George sighed, finally looking at me with a sort of weary resignation. "Look, Mark, between you and me, Brenda pretty much runs the show. She convinced a majority of the board that this was necessary. The club has its own accounts, supposed to be for lake projects. As for the rules, well, she presented them as an urgent operational update. Most of us just went along. It's easier than arguing with Brenda." His words, intended perhaps to pacify, only fueled my resolve. Easier for them meant unjust for me, and potentially for others. It confirmed my suspicion. Brenda was operating her own little dictatorship, and the board was either complicit or too cowed to object. The club account sounded fishy, especially if it wasn't transparently reported in the main HOA financials. This was when my professional instincts kicked into high gear. If the HOA was going to play fast and loose with its own rules, then it was time to look beyond the HOA, to the very foundation of their perceived authority over the lake. Most man-made lakes and developments like ours have a somewhat complex ownership history. Sometimes the developer retains ownership. Sometimes it's deeded to the HOA. Sometimes it's dedicated to the county or a special district. What if, I wondered, Brenda's claim to control the lake wasn't as solid as she thought? My first port of call was the county recorder's office. Armed with our community's plat maps and legal descriptions, I spent the better part of a day sifting through digital archives and dusty old deed books. My experience in real estate meant I knew what I was looking for: chains of title, easements, dedications, and any encumbrances on the property that constituted Serenity Lake. The deeper I dug, the more intriguing it became. The original developer, a company called Lakeside Living Inc., had indeed platted the subdivision and created the lake back in the late 1970s. They had recorded covenants that established the HOA. However, the specific deeds transferring ownership of the lake bed itself to the HOA were conspicuously absent. There were easements for access granted to homeowners, yes, but outright ownership? It wasn't clear. Lakeside Living Inc. had gone bankrupt in the mid-1980s, a common tale for developers during that era's recession. Their assets would have been sold off or transferred. But to whom? And did that include the lake? Or had it become an orphaned asset, its ownership muddled by the bankruptcy proceedings? I expanded my search to state corporate records and bankruptcy archives. It was like untangling a gigantic bowl of spaghetti, but I was tenacious. After several more days of research, including cross-referencing old tax records, I found a trail. It turned out that Lakeside Living Inc., in its dying throes, had transferred a portfolio of its lesser-performing or unclear title assets to a holding trust, a fairly common practice to quickly liquidate what they could and package the rest for later, hopefully more detailed, disposition. This Serenity Lake Holdings Trust was established, seemed to have paid minimal property taxes on a vaguely described parcel that corresponded to the lake for a few years, and then went dormant. The original trustees were long deceased. It was effectively a forgotten entity, a ghost in the legal machine. My heart began to beat a little faster. Could it be that this major amenity, the jewel of our community, the very thing Brenda McMillan was wielding like a royal scepter, was actually owned by a defunct trust that nobody, including the HOA, even knew existed? This discovery was like a shot of adrenaline. The next step was to discreetly find out if this trust, or any potential heirs or administrators of it, could even be located, and if so, what their understanding of their asset was. I engaged a specialist probate and property research firm, people I'd worked with before who were experts in navigating these kinds of legal labyrinths. I told them I was interested in potentially acquiring a distressed water body asset, and gave them the trust details. I also spoke to a few older residents, the original homeowners from the late 70s and early 80s. One delightful old lady, Mrs. Henderson, who remembered when the community was first built, recalled, "Oh, the lake! Back then it was just there, open to everyone." That nice young man from the developer, Mr. Carmichael, he used to say it was for all of us to enjoy. No clubs, no nonsense. This Brenda person, she's changed things. Her words echoed my growing conviction. The Serenity Lake Preservation Club, I suspected, was a complete fabrication, a tool for Brenda to consolidate power and, quite possibly, funds. If she was collecting dues for this club, where was that money going? Were there separate books? The HOA financials I received annually were somewhat opaque about specific lake expenditures beyond basic shoreline maintenance, which was already covered by general dues. The thought that Brenda might be running an off-the-books slush fund disguised as a preservation initiative made my blood boil, but I pushed that aside for now. First, ownership. It was all about ownership. A week later, the research firm called back. They'd managed to trace the descendants of the last known active trustee. These descendants lived several states away and were vaguely aware they were beneficiaries of some old family trust with bits and pieces of land somewhere, but had no idea it included a whole lake in our community. To them, it was a minor, forgotten line item in a dusty old file, occasionally generating a tiny tax bill that their family lawyer just paid. They had no emotional attachment to it, no interest in managing it, and certainly no knowledge of a pontoon-regulating HOA president named Brenda McMillan. When my intermediary discreetly inquired if they might be interested in divesting themselves of this distant, nebulous asset, their preliminary response was cautiously optimistic. They were, in essence, happy to be rid of a complication they barely knew they had. A grin, wide and genuine, spread across my face. "Brenda," I murmured to myself, looking out at the shimmering water of her supposed kingdom, "you have no idea what's coming." The moment the researchers confirmed the descendants of the original trustees were willing to sell their interest in the Serenity Lake Holdings Trust, I knew I had her. It wasn't just about the $5,000 fine anymore, or even about Brenda's petty tyranny. It was about rectifying a fundamental injustice, and, I won't lie, the sheer, exquisite irony of it all was incredibly appealing. The process of acquiring the trust, and thereby the lake, was something I was uniquely equipped to handle, thanks to my career. I knew it would require patience, discretion, and a good lawyer. The first call I made was to Sarah Evans, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney specializing in complex property and corporate law. I'd worked with Sarah on a couple of intricate deals in the past, and I trusted her implicitly. I laid out the whole story: Brenda, the pontoon, the bogus fine, the HOA's stonewalling, my research into the lake's ownership, and my audacious plan. Sarah listened intently, a slight smile playing on her lips as I recounted Brenda's pontoon power play. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mark," she said, the smile growing wider, "this is monumentally bold and potentially gloriously messy. Are you absolutely sure you want to go down this road? Buying an entire lake to settle a score with an HOA president? It's a bit like using a tactical nuke to swat a fly." I chuckled. "Perhaps, Sarah, but this fly has been buzzing in everyone's ear for too long, and it's drawing blood. Besides, it's not just a score anymore, it's about principle. And honestly, owning a lake could be a decent long-term investment if managed properly for the community. Plus, the image of Brenda's face when she found out was a powerful motivator," I privately admitted. Sarah nodded. "All right, principle it is, and maybe a little bit of spectacularly satisfying revenge. I'm in. Let's form a new LLC for you, something nondescript, to make the purchase. Keep your name out of it until you're ready for the grand reveal." We settled on Watershed Properties LLC. Anonymous, bland, perfect. The negotiations with the trust's beneficiaries were delicate. They were, understandably, a little surprised that someone was actively pursuing this forgotten asset. Sarah handled the initial discussions, framing it as a routine acquisition of undeveloped land by an investment group. We didn't want to alarm them or signal that this lake was the central feature of a thriving, high-value residential community. The last thing I needed was for them to suddenly realize they were sitting on a gold mine and jack up the price. Fortunately, their primary interest was a quick, clean sale to rid themselves of a minor administrative burden. We commissioned a formal survey and title search for Watershed Properties LLC, which confirmed my research. The trust unequivocally held title to the lakebed and certain riparian rights, unencumbered by any specific grant of ownership to the Serenity Lakes HOA beyond general access easements for residents to reach the shoreline. The HOA had, it appeared, simply assumed control over something they never actually owned, likely because no one ever questioned it. After a few weeks of back and forth, we agreed on a price. It was substantial. Of course, lakes don't come cheap, even forgotten ones, but well within my means, and frankly, a bargain considering its strategic value in this unfolding drama and its potential as a responsibly managed community asset. Clara was incredibly supportive, if a little wide-eyed. "So you're actually going to own the lake?" she'd asked one evening. "The whole thing?" I grinned. "The whole darn puddle, sweetheart." She just shook her head, a mixture of amusement and admiration in her eyes. "Brenda McMillan is going to have a conniption." That, I thought, was putting it mildly. While Sarah worked on finalizing the purchase agreement for Watershed Properties LLC, I continued my own meticulous preparations. First, I formally paid the $5,000 fine under protest. I sent the check with another registered letter, stating that while I maintained the fine was illegitimate, I was paying it to avoid further punitive actions or liens, pending a full investigation and potential legal challenge. This served two purposes. It lulled Brenda into a false sense of victory, making her think I'd caved, and it established my damages for any future lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful fining. Brenda, I heard through the grapevine, specifically from George Peterson's wife, who was a friend of Clara's and no fan of Brenda's autocratic style, was insufferably smug about it. See? She'd apparently gloated at the next informal board get-together. Mr. Thompson finally saw reason. People just need to understand who's in charge for this community to run smoothly. Oh, Brenda, you have no idea. While the legal paperwork for the lake acquisition slowly churned through the system, these things take time. I became an avid photographer and videographer. Every time Brenda's Serenity Lake Preservation Club held an event, which was surprisingly frequent now that they felt emboldened, I was there, discreetly documenting. Pontoon parties, kayak races, even members-only swimming sessions in the choicest spots. I logged dates, times, approximate numbers of participants, and even, where possible, identified specific board members gleefully partaking in their exclusive access on what was, unbeknownst to them, about to become my private property. Each photo, each snippet of video, was another nail in the coffin I was building for Brenda's reign. My neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind, or perhaps developing a bizarre fixation on lake activities. I'd see them giving me curious looks as I sat on my deck with a long-lens camera or walked the shoreline path with a camcorder. Let them wonder. The closing on the lake happened on a gray Tuesday in late September. No fanfare, just me, Sarah, and a mountain of paperwork signed on behalf of Watershed Properties LLC. When Sarah handed me the finalized recorded deed, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, mixed with a little bit of disbelief. I, Mark Thompson, now owned Serenity Lake. The sheer audacity of it still amazed me. For a few days, I did nothing. I just savored the knowledge. I'd walk down to my little dock, look out over my water, and a slow smile would spread across my face. Brenda and her cronies were still operating under the blissful delusion that this was their personal playground. Their Fall Colors Pontoon Parade was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. Perfect. I had Sarah draft the formal notices, trespass warnings, demand letters, invoices. We calculated a reasonable daily access fee for unauthorized recreational use of a private lake, based on comparable private lake club memberships and commercial boat rental rates in the region. Then we multiplied that by the number of boats, the number of individuals, and the documented number of days they'd been using my lake since Watershed Properties LLC officially took title. The figures were significant. We didn't just target the HOA as an entity. We also prepared individual notices for Brenda McMillan and every board member I documented, actively participating in these club activities on my property. Their personal liability would be a beautiful little cherry on top. The stage was set, the trap was baited, and Brenda McMillan was about to sail her gaudy pontoon straight into it. The first Saturday in October dawned crisp and beautiful perfect autumn weather for Brenda's Fall Colors Pontoon Parade. From my deck, I watched the preparations unfold. Various boats, festooned with garish plastic gourds and rustling sheaves of artificial autumn leaves, began to gather near the community boat ramp. Brenda's flagship pontoon, the Empress, was, of course, the most ostentatiously decorated, with a large Serenity Lake Preservation Club, members only, banner draped proudly across its side. She was holding court on deck, wearing a truly hideous orange and brown sequin sweater, directing the lesser boats into formation with imperious waves of her hand. Little did she know, Sarah Evans, armed with a sheaf of legally binding documents and a process server, was already en route, instructed to arrive precisely at the moment the parade was in full, glorious swing. I had my long lens camera ready, not just for evidence, but for the sheer historical significance of the moment. Around 2 p.m., as the Empress and its flotilla of about 15 other boats bobbed merrily in the middle of what was now unequivocally my lake, Sarah and the process server, a stern-looking fellow named Mr. Riverford Davies, arrived at the HOA community clubhouse, where Brenda often held her impromptu court when not on the water. They requested to speak with her. Tiffany, the receptionist, predictably flustered, informed them Mrs. McMillan was indisposed, presiding over a very important lake event. Sarah, with a polite smile, informed Tiffany that their business was directly related to that very important lake event and concerned the lake itself. Reluctantly, Tiffany radioed Brenda. I can only imagine Brenda's irritation at being interrupted. Through my binoculars, I saw Brenda snatch up her marine radio, listen for a moment, her expression turning from regal command to annoyed impatience. She barked a short reply, then handed the radio to one of her flunkies. A few minutes later, a small runabout detached from the parade and sped towards the shore, returning shortly with Brenda, looking thoroughly put out. She stormed into the clubhouse where Sarah and Mr. Davies were waiting. According to Sarah's later recounting, which she delivered with considerable professional relish, Brenda swept in demanding, "All right, what is so critically important that it requires interrupting the Fall Colors Parade?" I trust this is brief. Sarah, calm and collected, introduced herself as counsel for Watershed Properties LLC, the legal owners of Serenity Lake. Brenda blinked. Watershed Properties? Never heard of them. And we own this lake? Or at least the HOA does, which is me. What is this nonsense? Sarah simply smiled and said, "Perhaps you'd like to examine these documents, Mrs. McMillan." Mr. Davies then stepped forward and formally served Brenda, in her capacity as HOA president, with a thick envelope. He then proceeded to serve her with another, identical envelope, addressed to her personally. Brenda snatched them, a look of utter bewilderment on her face. She tore open the one addressed to the HOA. Her eyes scanned the first page. Her perfectly applied lipstick seemed to mow in confusion. Then her jaw tightened. She flipped through the pages, her face draining of color with each one. The demand letter clearly stated that Serenity Lake was private property, owned by Watershed Properties, LLC. It detailed numerous instances of trespass by the HOA and its Serenity Lake Preservation Club. It included an itemized invoice for unauthorized usage, docking, and environmental impact assessment based on their activities since the date of my purchase. The total demanded from the HOA, a cool $1.8 million. Then, she ripped open the personal envelope. Her face, already pale, went ashen. The personal notice detailed her specific trespasses, her role in organizing the unauthorized events, and held her personally liable for a significant portion, citing her direct instigation and clear knowledge, particularly since she was the one who told me about the club. Her individual invoice was for $250, citing gross negligence and abuse of her position. Witnesses in the small clubhouse lobby later reported that Brenda swayed slightly and had to grip the reception counter for support. This is outrageous," she finally stammered. "A mistake. It has to be a mistake. This is our lake," Sarah replied coolly. "I assure you, Mrs. McMillan, there is no mistake. Watershed Properties LLC holds clear title, duly recorded with the county. Perhaps you'd like your attorney to review the enclosed deed and title report?" Brenda just stared, speechless, the documents trembling in her hand. Similar envelopes were simultaneously being delivered by courier to the homes of the other board members who'd been such enthusiastic club participants. The Fall Colors Pontoon Parade, I noted with grim satisfaction from my vantage point, had suddenly lost all its festive momentum. Boats were drifting aimlessly as news, or at least confused whispers, began to spread. The trap had been sprung. The queen bee was buzzing, but her stinger was nowhere to be found. Instead, she'd flown directly into a very large, very expensive, and entirely legally constructed spiderweb. And I, Mark Thompson, owner of Watershed Properties LLC, was the spider, patiently waiting. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Brenda McMillan, I was told, spent the rest of that Saturday alternately screeching into her phone at the HOA's bewildered attorney, a man named Arthur Jenkins, no relation to the petunia-loving Harold, thankfully, though perhaps just as spineless, and then descending into stunned, furious silence. The other board members who received their own personal trespass notices and invoices, ranging from 50, 0 to 100, 0, depending on their level of participation in the club's activities on my newly acquired property, reacted with varying degrees of panic, disbelief, and outrage. Suddenly, blind loyalty to Brenda wasn't looking so appealing. An emergency HOA board meeting was called for Sunday evening. It was, by all accounts from my sources, Mrs. Henderson had a surprisingly effective intelligence network among the longer-term, less Brenda-infatuated residents, an absolute circus. Brenda, apparently having regained some of her bluster, tried to paint Watershed Properties LLC as some predatory outside corporation trying to extort the community. She insisted the claims were baseless, that the HOA had historic rights to the lake, whatever that meant. "They can't do this to us," she reportedly thundered. "We will fight this. This is Serenity Lakes. We are Serenity Lake." Harold Jenkins, the treasurer, who had also received a hefty personal invoice, looked like he was about to faint. His prized petunias were likely the last thing on his mind. George Peterson, the accountant board member I'd spoken to earlier, actually spoke up, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "Brenda, with all due respect, these documents look very official. They include a copy of a recorded deed. Did our attorney review this deed? Do we in fact own the lake?" The HOA attorney, Arthur Jenkins, had by then done a quick, panicked title search himself over the weekend. He arrived at the emergency meeting looking pale and harried. His report to the board was grim. Watershed Properties LLC, he confirmed, did indeed appear to hold clear, legally recorded title to Serenity Lake. The HOA's claims to ownership were based on, as he put it, long-standing assumption rather than explicit conveyance. There was no specific deed transferring the lakebed to the HOA. Their D owed directors and officers, insurance carrier, when he'd made a panicked preliminary inquiry, had already started asking uncomfortable questions about due diligence and potential misrepresentation of authority, especially concerning the Serenity Lake Preservation Club and its unaudited finances. The air in the room, I imagine, grew very cold. The board members who had happily rubber-stamped Brenda's club and its rules were now staring at personal financial ruin. Brenda, faced with the undeniable legal facts presented by her own attorney, finally seemed to deflate. Her rage gave way to a sort of bewildered sputtering. The idea that someone else, some faceless LLC, now owned her lake, was simply inconceivable to her. Sarah, representing Watershed Properties LLC, attended the next official HOA meeting, held a week later, to which all residents were invited, and news of the fiasco had spread like wildfire. So, attendance was at an all-time high. She didn't reveal my identity as the owner yet. She calmly laid out the facts, presented copies of the deed, the survey, and a timeline of documented trespass. She also politely inquired about the Serenity Lake Preservation Club's financials and its legal standing, noting its apparent lack of formal registration or transparent accounting practices, hinting that further investigations into potential financial irregularities might be forthcoming if the trespass issue wasn't resolved amicably. This was a carefully crafted implication, designed to ramp up the pressure, especially on Brenda. The atmosphere in the community hall was electric. Residents were shocked, angry, confused. Some directed their anger at this new owner, but many, especially those who had chafed under Brenda's rule or had been excluded by her club, began to turn their glare towards Brenda herself. The murmurs grew louder. She told us the club was official. Where did all that club money go? She fined people based on rules for a lake we didn't even own? Brenda tried to defend herself, but her arguments were weak, her voice shrill. The edifice of her power was crumbling before her very eyes, on public display. Her enablers on the board were silent, trying to make themselves as small as possible. It was a masterclass in public implosion. The negotiations, when they finally began in earnest a few days later, were less of a negotiation and more of a carefully managed surrender on the HOA's part. Their lawyer, Arthur, knew they were caught between a rock and a very expensive hard place. Litigation would be ruinously costly and, in his professional opinion, almost certainly unsuccessful. The HOA's DO insurance was unlikely to cover damages arising from such a clear case of operating outside their authority, especially if there was evidence of willful misconduct or gross negligence in how the Preservation Club was managed. Brenda's personal exposure was immense. My demands, delivered through Sarah, were firm but, I believed, ultimately fair given the circumstances. First, immediate cessation of all unauthorized activities on Serenity Lake by the HOA or its affiliates. Second, dissolution of the Serenity Lake Preservation Club and a full independent audit of its finances, with any misappropriated funds to be returned or accounted for. Third, a formal public apology from the HOA board to all residents for the misrepresentation of lake ownership and the imposition of illegitimate rules and fines. Fourth, a substantial payment to Watershed Properties LLC for the documented trespass. I wasn't actually trying to bankrupt the HOA. That wouldn't serve anyone in the long run. The $1.8 million figure had been an opening gambit, designed to get their absolute, undivided attention. My real goal was reform and restitution. We eventually settled on a figure that was still significant, enough to sting and to fund what I had planned next, but manageable for the HOA through a special assessment that they would have to levy, a painful reminder to everyone about the cost of unchecked power. For Brenda McMillan and the most complicit board members, the personal invoices remained, though Sarah negotiated them down to amounts that would be severely painful but perhaps not lead to personal bankruptcy, unless they fought, in which case all bets were off. Brenda, facing potential further investigation into the club's finances and massive personal liability, ended up paying a very substantial 5-figure sum out of her own pocket. It was a fraction of the initial demand, but, I knew, a devastating blow to her finances and ego. The grand reveal of my ownership came during a community meeting convened to discuss the settlement. After Sarah outlined the terms, she paused and said, "And now, the principal of Watershed Properties LLC, who is, in fact, one of your own neighbors, would like to say a few words." All eyes scanned the room. I stood up. You could have heard a pin drop. Then a collective gasp. Brenda, who was present but sitting in the back, looking diminished and haggard, simply stared, her mouth agape. I explained my motivations, the unjust fine, the principle of the matter, but also my desire to see the lake become a true community asset, managed transparently and fairly. I announced the formation of the Serenity Lake Community Trust, to which a significant portion of the HOA settlement payment, along with Brenda's personal contribution, would be directed. This trust, I explained, would oversee the lake's maintenance, ecological health, and equitable access for all residents of Serenity Lakes. I, through Watershed Properties LLC, would retain ownership of the lakebed, but would grant a long-term, low-cost lease to the community trust. I would serve as an initial trustee to get it established, alongside other reputable residents who were not part of the old guard. Access wouldn't be free. A modest annual household fee, far less than Brenda's club dues, would go to the trust to fund its work, but it would be fair, transparent, and for everyone. The relief in the room was palpable. The anger at the HOA's incompetence slowly began to be replaced by a tentative hope. Brenda McMillan resigned as HOA president effective immediately, her reign over. Most of her board followed suit shortly thereafter. A new, interim board was quickly formed, comprised of residents eager for transparency and reform. The aftermath was, in many ways, more satisfying than the confrontation itself. The independent audit of the Serenity Lake Preservation Club revealed sloppy bookkeeping and funds used for social events that primarily benefited Brenda and her inner circle, rather than actual lake preservation. While not overtly criminal, it was enough to permanently tarnish her reputation. She and her husband sold their house and moved away within 6 months, unable to bear the disgrace and the cool disdain of their former subjects. The Serenity Lake Community Trust flourished. With proper funding and engaged community members on its board, we implemented sensible rules for lake usage, focused on safety, enjoyment, and genuine ecological preservation. We organized community cleanup days, invested in fish stocking programs, and improved the public access points. The lake became a unifying feature of the community, not a divisive one. My $5,000 fine, which I'd paid under protest, was formally rescinded by the new HOA board, and the money was donated to the community trust as its first official act, which I thought was a nice touch. Clara and I still take the Wanderer out on Serenity Lake. It's more peaceful now, in every sense of the word. Sometimes, I look out over the water, my water in title, but our water in spirit, and I can't help but smile. It was a long, strange, and expensive journey from that initial ridiculous fine to owning a lake. But every step, every bit of research, every tense negotiation, was worth it to dismantle a petty tyranny and restore a bit of fairness and sanity to our little corner of the world. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard or experienced? I bet it's hard to top this one. Thanks for watching QA Stories, folks. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this slice of suburban justice, subscribe for more, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next tale of when quiet and unassuming decides enough is enough.